in the hard category. I didn't have actual copies of the ones used by Anderson and Kilduff, but I'm suspecting that they fell in the easy category. We had the participants complete a questionnaire containing dominance and extroversion measures, attempt the problems individually, convene and attempt problems as a group, and rate each other's confidence, influence, and participation. And what did we get? Here's participation, rated participation. For the easy problems, the striped bars are the competent people, the solid bars are the incompetent. For the easy problem, it didn't matter whether you were competent or incompetent. In fact, it didn't matter whether you were dominant or non-dominant. What we did for this analysis was just divide the 4 members of the groups and doing a median split in each group. But it does make a big difference when you were doing the difficult. In this case, the competent people were participating a whole lot more, or at least rated to be participating a whole lot more. I don't have the objective measures yet, we will get those. But perceived to participate a whole lot more than their non-competent members. Notice though that it still doesn't hurt to be a little bit high on the social dominance scale. You get similar patterns if you look at rated competence. Easy task, you don't need to be competent to be seen as competent. Rated influence, same kind of pattern. So basically, we argue that you get competence and not dominance, predicting influence and participation when there are valid. Well, I actually didn't present this data in the interest of time, so let me just believe that conclusion. And we're arguing that for collective tasks that are intellectually and moderately difficult, you're going to get competence trumpeting dominance. So the kind of take-home conclusion here is that there's a small sweet spot where competence trumps dominance in the influence game. And do I have 30 seconds? Sure. Yeah, this is my alternate exit point. I'll go on and get myself in real trouble here. One of the things, if you were following me and one step ahead of me, which is probably very likely, you're saying, well, if you had replicated Anderson and Kilduff, shouldn't these bars be up here for the easy task, where the dominant people are really influencing more, or participating more, or being seen as more competent? And my answer would be yes. So basically, we didn't get the same effect that Anderson and Kilduff did. We did get the effect we predicted in the sense that hard tasks or more difficult tasks are the ones where you get the distinction between competent and non-competence. It led us to think a little bit about why didn't we replicate. And the other thing about the Anderson and Kilduff study was that they were to solve as many problems as possible in the given time. And that's what the performance was based on. Whereas you could classify ours as an optimizing problem. They had 10 problems to solve, and they were to do as good as they could on the 10 problems. And it really now brings me to think that maybe to get the Anderson-Kilduff effect, we need to have a maximizing test. So perhaps to get competence trumping dominance, you do need a collective test. And it's really not clear whether the task has to be optimized. In other words, if we had them doing as many problems as possible, and so some were working with easy and some were with difficult, would we have gotten the effect for the difficult problems if they were trying to solve as many as they could? Maybe it's still possible that dominance prevails when you're doing a maximizing problem. So the real question is, how small is the sweet spot where competence trumps dominance? Thanks to my collaborators and to a good crew of undergraduate students who helped me to complete this study. Thank you.
NSCC, Lord Kerr did arrive, so he will be our next speaker.
First, let me note that Rob McCoon was an active collaborator on this project. He didn't appear on the program last time. We worked on this together. I'm going to talk about juries. And about 20 years ago, around 1990, we thought we had a pretty good idea of how criminal juries reach their decisions. And a lot of that knowledge was based upon 15 or 20 years Davis had been doing on the jury at this time. We thought, for example, that any time they began deliberation with a fairly large majority, you could predict with fairly high probability that that would be the outcome of the jury deliberation. When you started without such a large majority, one obvious thing occurred, and that was it was going to be more difficult to reach any decision at all, and that's not too surprising. But there was a second result which was a little bit more surprising, and that was there seemed to be a asymmetry in the relative influence of factions that favored acquittal versus those that favored conviction. And I'll show you a particular result. This is a study that Rob McCoon and I did in 1985 using 6-person juries. And this is a standard estimated social decision scheme. The numbers in this matrix actually represent the proportions of groups that began with a certain initial split and ended with a particular final verdict. And so what you can see here in the first 3 rows where there is first 2 rows at least, where there are large majorities, they almost always prevail, 81% of the time. Down here, 89% of the time. You can see that the proportions of hung juries are larger here in the middle of the range where there is no majority. And then this other effect that we're talking about, this pro-defendant asymmetry, is also evident. And the best place to see it is here in the place where you have an actually equal split between pro and conviction and anti-conviction juries. And what you see here is among those that were able to reach a decision, there was about a 4-to-1 ratio between those who acquitted versus those who convicted. That is, it was 4 times more likely that they would find the defendant not guilty than that they would find the defendant guilty, even though the factions that began deliberation were of equal size, were opposing one another. You can also see this offline here too, that is a majority for acquittal was a more powerful, a minority for acquittal was a more powerful minority than a comparable sized minority for conviction. So in both in terms of symmetric splits and small majorities, you find this asymmetry effect. Rob McCoon and I then went and did a meta-analysis of this literature, and those of you sitting close to the front can see this guy Davis keeps popping up a lot. Davis, there's another Davis thing. He's active in this literature, and what we find that when you look across the about dozen or so studies that were available at that time, that the probability that when you began with an equal split that you would end up with an acquittal was 0.81 in this small literature. So this, we call that in that paper, the 85 paper, the leniency bias. We also did a second study where we tried to find out why it happened. And we provided some evidence that this was due to the instructions that jurors were given in standard criminal cases. They're given a reasonable doubt criterion that says you really have to give the defendant every benefit of the doubt. And that also extends to the idea of what if you're divided equally socially in the group? Shouldn't it be the case that the ties go to the defendant? And we did a study where you gave them a symmetric standard, and we said, in this state, preponderance of evidence applies to criminal cases. So whichever side has the strongest case, that's the one that wins, no matter what. So there's no hint that you're supposed to show some favoritism for the defendant. And when you do that, you don't get the asymmetry effect. So that seems to us in around the late 80s, early 90s, that we nicely tied up and bundled this effect. One point I'll make here is that since jurors were doing exactly what they were told to do by the judge, it was really a misnomer to call it a bias. I think we were careless to say that this was anti-normative or this was a departure from what they ought to be doing. In fact, it's precisely what they ought to be doing if they understand and follow the instructions of the judge. Now, all of this, the 13 or so studies that we met and analyzed, were almost all based upon mock juries done with college students, since they're easily accessible to us, and we presume their psychology is somewhat resembling their parents and the rest of humanity. But some people have raised the question, well, should we then find the same kind of pattern in actual juries? And that's where the trouble started. We were starting to get demurs from people working out in the field that this asymmetry effect actually occurred. I'll show you the results from one of several studies done in the field. This was one done by Sandys and Dillahay, published in '95. And they have 2 different samples here. One is what they do is they survey jurors, real jurors who've been in trials after the trial is over, and ask them recall what the split was at the beginning of your deliberation, so they can identify the preponderance for conviction and acquittal, and then what was your final verdict. They had one set of 43 cases, you can see the number there, where they required that they get some corroboration, they get at least 2 jurors to agree upon what the initial split was. And when they did that, there weren't a lot of the sort of vital cases. This is the case where you had 6 of 12 jurors voting for conviction at the first ballot. There were only 3 such juries in their sample, but all 3 of them found for guilty, which they thought, that's odd, given what we'd seen in this meta-analysis. They had a larger sample where they took one juror's word for what exactly happened there. And there they got a much larger sample, 253, and there were 24 juries in all that began with 6 people for guilty, and of those, a few hung, 2, but 17 found guilty and only 5 found for acquittal. And said, now, that's getting really odd. And even if you do a little test of that, just in that simple row, you find this is statistically significant in the wrong direction, given what we've seen before. So, that got Rob and I interested in this. To summarize this, there are at least 4 such field studies, and in them, either they find no difference at all of symmetry in these equally split juries, or, as we saw in this last one, an actual tendency towards conviction. And as I said, in at least one study there, that simple trend was even significant. It's a problem here, they're really small samples in a critical row. It's hard to get a lot of juries to begin with, and to get them in exactly the place you want them is even more difficult. So Devine et al., who were one of these 4 people who've done these studies, wrote the following in the 2001 paper, which I think is a fair summary of the knowledge at that stage. They said, overall, although there's clearly not yet enough data to draw definitive conclusions, the strong leniency bias observed in laboratory studies may be weaker or less reliable in actual juries. And this sort of fed a belief among a lot of field researchers that these simulations are misleading. We ought to leave it to the field researchers to study real jury behavior, and these guys are amateurs and should ignore what they say. Well, that got under my skin. So we decided that we were going to look into this. And so I'm going to tell you today about some problems with these field data for the particular question that we're talking about here. We don't have time this morning to go through all these in any detail. And you may not even be able to see them without detail. One of the problems is that they don't actually have the pre-deliberation preferences, they have the recollections of people afterwards. And one interesting thing was that you got a lot of disagreement among jurors about how the deliberations began, suggesting that memories were flawed, and there's at least a lot of random error in those recollections. There's a second problem, and there we go, and that is they don't actually have what people said when they began deliberation. What they have is the first ballot vote, which is different. Sometimes there's some discussion going on between the time you walk in and when you take your first ballot. Now, in all the simulation studies, you compel people to make a decision before the deliberation begins. They said, well, if you had to make this decision entirely on your own, which verdict would you favor? So that's what we based our splits on to look for this leniency bias. What they look at is what is the first vote in the public vote. And Jim Davis, his name keeps popping up here, in 1988 did a study where he found that there was some systematic drift such that people who voted guilty on the first ballot were more likely to actually favor not guilty, the other way around, who favored not guilty in their individual preference when they took the first ballot would say, I get this, who favored guilty would say not guilty. So this bias to say, well, if I'm going to do anything, I'm going to bend over a little bit backwards. It's sort of like Henry Fonda in 12 Angry Men. He says he's probably guilty. But I think we really owe it to him that somebody ought to say not guilty here so we can have some discussion about this. So that means that there's actually that first ballot might not be an accurate descriptor of what people actually favored to begin with. I'm going to talk about a third problem in the coding of these data. And if you look in the fine print, this is good advice for